Hey, it's Matthew Cudmore. Welcome to Story Behind the Stone. Today we're joined by Allan Hunn, founder of Escape and Evasion Research and Tours. Allan is a retired aircraft maintenance engineer with 25 years of Royal Air Force service, followed by 18 years with Airbus. Join us as Allan takes us deep into the mountains of Europe. He spent years researching, retracing, and walking a significant number of escape routes taken by Allied soldiers, sailors, airmen, and even special operations executive agents who risked everything to return home during the Second World War. After recording this episode, I was so inspired that I approached today's guest, Allan Hunn, about creating a map of my great-grandfather's, Charles Thwaites-Smith's, military service in the First World War. A family member had gone to great pains to transcribe the war diaries that he started in 1914 to digital. When the First World War broke out, he joined in the first major motions of the Mesopotamia campaign, landing in Basra, Iraq. He wrote about the first major battles, the carnage that he saw, officers crying quietly at the losses, leaving their men behind. After fighting further into Iraq, he, along with his garrison, were encircled. They survived 5 months under siege, cut off from resupply, before ultimately surrendering and becoming a prisoner of war and surviving a death march across Iraq. My conversation with Allan sparked something, and it's thanks to this conversation that I was inspired to open the diaries back up, to start piecing some of the puzzle back together for myself over 112 years after my great-grandfather started writing. Thankfully, he survived wartime and he made it home. I'm here today because he survived, the diaries survived. And I've never felt more connected to Charles than I do now. And as it happens, I learned that my great-grandfather and I have a connection that I couldn't have predicted. In one passage, Charles writes about artillery shells landing in Basra Cemetery as he digs graves for his comrades. And now I have the honor of working with the commission to help tell the stories of these individuals buried in the exact same cemetery. I truly hope that you enjoyed today's episode. I hope that you find your own spark to dust off those photo albums and embark on your own journey. When you're ready, you won't regret it. Hello and welcome to Story Behind the Stone, a show where we talk service, sacrifice, and story, connecting the people doing the most interesting things, veterans' causes, and commemorations. Today's guest, Allan Hunn, with Escape and Evasion Research and Tours, a mountain trekking guide. You have such a fascinating area of expertise and practice in helping people connect with individuals that are doing these escape and evasion routes in and around Europe. I'm so excited to chat with you today, Allan. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Matthew. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Allan, if you could just share with us, what is it that you're doing with the escape and evasion routes? What does a day in the life look like? It's such an interesting topic.
About 13 years ago, I had a walk in the Pyrenees mountains, and I heard a story about escape and evasion, and it just absolutely enthralled me. I took a slightly deeper look, and this new world just opened up in front of me of hundreds and hundreds of men crossing the Pyrenees throughout World War II. The toughness of some of the journeys, but also the resilience that they had in order to complete them. And then also the incredible helpers in France that these people were prepared to sacrifice everything in order to help servicemen return to the UK and continue fighting. So they were at an enormous risk. Yeah, just inspired by these incredible people.
If you could kind of paint a scene for us, the geography that you're working with, you've mentioned the Pyrenees. Tell us a little bit where these routes are taking place.
They're throughout the Pyrenees. So if we start at the Mediterranean Pyrenees, it's relatively low ground. The beginning of World War II, an awful lot of soldiers from the Dunkirk and St. Valery periods crossed the Pyrenees there. First having gone to Marseille, being corralled by a number of officers to try and organize getting them across, and then actually doing the journeys. And that itself evolved into a very famous escape line, the Patalery escape line. Then if we move inland further, we hit the Ariège region of France, which a large part of that, it borders with Andorra. And hundreds of escapers and evaders went across there. And that's more high mountains. Then we move further inland and we come to the high Pyrenees. So quite a few 3,000 meter peaks and obviously some very high cols to cross. So quite a tough area to get across the Pyrenees, to say the least. And then the terrain begins to get slightly lower as we move towards the Atlantic region. So there's a significant chunk of the Pyrenees are referred to as the Atlantic Pyrenees, albeit they're inland. And there's some tough journeys there. And then we have the Atlantic region, which is where the Comet Line used to operate. And that's lower ground, but it's Atlantic type weather there. So lots of rain, a very fertile region, but still very tough. Still had a lot of snow in winter and those sorts of things to make the journeys quite tough.
Can you tell us a little bit about the individuals that are undertaking this? What are the circumstances? What's going on?
It comes back to this period at the beginning of the war where we had the Dunkirk and the St. Valery BEF, the British Expeditionary Force, collapsing under German attack. A lot of those soldiers were taken prisoner and they were being slowly route marched to Germany, firstly through France. And a lot of them took the opportunity to escape. A lot of those escapers were looked after locally. The local French, the local Belgians took care of them. And then it slowly dawned upon them, especially with the signing of the treaty between the Germans and Vichy France, or the Free Zone, that there was an area of France that may be accessible and may allow for them to travel home. So they made their journey principally to Marseille and, as we mentioned earlier, then across the Pyrenees. They also exfiltrated on boats, firstly to Marseille and then latterly down towards Spain. They were also exfiltrated by special operations executive boats. And also there was an incredible Dr. Rodocanachi, which is quite a mouthful, but he was a Greek doctor that was associated with the Patalieri line, and he was essentially signing off people as being medically unfit for further military service, and they'd get repatriated. And he was doing that in quite a surreptitious way because many of them could carry on fighting. So he was doing an awful lot to help. Then we really progress from there. You have the Battle of Britain, and what follows that is once that battle is essentially won, it's taking the fight to the Germans. And so you would have fighter and bomber sweeps over into France. So the bombers, there'd be a few light bombers going across, and they'd have a heavy escort of fighters. And the fighters were there to draw the Germans into battle. So quite a few pilots and aircrew, for that matter, then ended up evading pretty much in similar circumstances, northern France down to Marseille, then across the Pyrenees. Then we have the bombing campaign as, again, taking the fight to Germany. So the earlier type bombers, the Wellington and the Hampden, not perhaps anywhere near as advanced as the Lancasters, Halifax and B-17s. A lot of those crews were shot down, and again, they would evade. Then we come to the period where 11th of November 1942, Germany invades the Free Zone, the Vichy France, depending on how you look at it. And that starts to become actually a turning point in World War II. Then we have the Americans joining the bombing campaign. So the 8th Air Force comes to the UK, and there are an awful lot more aeroplanes getting shot down and an awful lot more crews that can evade. That needs to be taken care of. So there's quite an expansion of escape lines. We also have within that period the commando raids on the coast of France. So there's things like Operation Frankton, which is more commonly known as the Cockleshell Heroes. Two of them evade through the Pyrenees as well. And we have Operation Jubilee, similar overtones, and there's a few evaders from that. And then also Operation Chariot. And again, there's quite a few evaders there. That progresses, and we then come to D-Day. There's still escape lines operating at that period, but it tends to drop off from about there because it's very, very clear that Germany's lost the war, and then they're giving up their territory in France, and so the escape lines lessen. There was still plenty of escape and evasion. There were worries that once the D-Day had occurred, that you still needed to take care of aircrew. So they were hidden in Frétival Forest down in or up towards northern France. And then you have still aircraft being shot down and crews escaping, evading, and they tend to stay in safe places and actually help the resistance out in attacking the Germans. And that's where it kind of really tails off. And then, of course, there are other areas of Europe where there's still plenty of escape and evasion going on.
What are you doing with your company to apply a new lens to this history?
Yeah, there's a huge part is the research. That's where the majority of the time is spent. But it then becomes, how do we remember these events, what these people went through? The way that's divided up is into battlefield tours in a very traditional sense. So a little bit different because it's in the mountains. There's certain areas that are very accessible. So you can participate in these battlefield tours. Minimal walking allows for people who don't have the access to the full mountain ranges. So there's that side of things. Then we have the walking tours. Those are anything from 1 day long to about 10 days, which is an incredible route through Andorra. And then there's self-guided walking packages, which are really coming to life now. And those allow for experienced walkers within the mountains in order to take a package and organize their own journey in the sense of guidance from the package. And there's also producing maps for families. So it's a small service in the sense of generating a map with a route that tells a story about where a particular family member walked through the Pyrenees.
Are there any individual family stories that you could share, without sharing names, of course, for privacy reasons, but be really curious to see kind of how you can help provide some of these families closure, but also that experience as well?
Well, there's 3 small stories that can be linked together quite nicely. One of them was very, very special to me because it concerned a chap called Sergeant Harry Camish. I discovered that Harry was still alive in 2023, living in New Zealand. I managed to make contact with his family. It was for the purpose of Harry to look at an escape and evasion map that I had generated. And really to seek his approval and show him respect in that manner. I had a really lovely exchange with his daughter, and then sadly Harry had an accident which put him in a difficult position, so it wasn't so easy to communicate, but I kept looking and researching the story, and I visited where he went across the Pyrenees, and it kind of really completely blew me away. Walked into a French village one Sunday morning, spotted a group of locals, so I, politely as I could, tried to join their conversation. They pointed me to a chap who was walking by, who was strangely dressed in greens and had a handlebar mustache, and he told me to wait for 10 minutes and he'd be back to collect me, and he took me to his house and you could tell what his wife was saying is like, where the hell have you been? And it was, I've picked up a mad Englishman who wants to talk to me. And the kind of response was, really? And she came downstairs and kind of went, he's telling the truth. But this gentleman and I sat down and I asked him the question, where did people leave the village from? Because yes, you're in a valley. There's lots of footpaths. Where could Harry have walked? Pointed out straight away the 2 main routes out the village, which was just incredible. Said my goodbyes to Francois, had a quick walk, and then I dashed off to the next stage of the journey. And I got to a point which is very accessible. You park your car a couple of 100 meters up a small incline, and you can literally see the vast majority of Harry's route. So you look north and you can see where he would have walked down, and then you actually look eastward and you can see where he crossed into Spain. The amazing thing about this story is that they got to a certain point, a very large group of 21 evaders with quite a few French resistance. One of the evaders fell when crossing a river and literally cracked his skull. So there was a bit of a commotion and there was a German patrol nearby. There wasn't a direct engagement. The evaders carried on and got to a certain point for arrest. and that's where they were compromised by the Germans. So there was a kind of bomb burst of all these invaders trying to get away, and Harry, with at least 3 Americans, shot off. So there was a technical sergeant, Archie Barlow, there was a Lieutenant Lynn Drollinger, who'd already tried to evade across the Pyrenees, and then a Lieutenant James Lyles. So these 3 guys shot off, and essentially, in a very, very difficult journey, they got close to the border with Spain. They then detected a German patrol, which was essentially warming up and waiting for these invaders to cross their path. They managed to avoid them, only to be spotted as they were going up the mountainside towards Spain. So the Germans opened fire, and you can begin to imagine what the feeling was like for that. But nevertheless, they managed to make it over the mountainside. They bomb burst, but one of the Americans was so exhausted that he fainted, but fortunately fainted in a position where the Germans didn't see him. In a nutshell, these 3 guys got into Spain, and they were joined by about 3 others that had gone slightly different routes. So amazing story, but it's that classic, you can see from one point the vast majority of the route and get an appreciation of the difficulty. What's fascinating about that and how it links to the other group is there were 3 resistance stroke passeurs, smugglers to get them across the border. And there was a chap called Joseph Barrère. He was known as Frisco, but he was, if you like, really a French American that had come over to do his bit. Then there was a Jean-Louis Berserk, who was known as Charbonnier. He was the lead and quite a character by all accounts. And then a Pierre Sabadie, and again, he was with that group. They were looking after Harry to a point, and the other guys, and they had a lot to do with, if you like, or potentially a lot to do with the next story. So the one that links is after Harry, one of the great escapers, Bram van der Stok, escaped across the Pyrenees. So 76 escaped from Stalag 3, 73 were recaptured, 50 were murdered, and 3 got away. So 2 were Norwegian, and they went north and crossed safely to Sweden. But Bram van der Stok went via the Pyrenees. Of course, he was Dutch, and he got picked up by the Dutch Paris line. He was supposed to be escorted by these 3 passeurs resistance, but unfortunately, they were heading towards a village in their car one day, rounded a corner to see a German, what they thought was a German ambush. So they opened fire, and very sadly, all 3 were killed and their bodies treated quite awfully. They found replacements to take Bram van der Stok across. Within the group he was in, there were 2 Canadians. So there was a Flight Sergeant Shaughnessy and a Flying Officer Thomas. But there were 2 Americans. So there was a Lieutenant McPherson, who was a P-47 pilot, and then a Lieutenant Stonebarger, who I believe was, I think, a pilot of a B-17. So I need to double check I've got that exactly right, but I think we get the kind of message. So they were accompanied by at least 2 Jewish families, which again is another huge part of this. They made it across the Pyrenees in June, and they were then followed by another incredible person who was Anne-Marie Walters, who was a special operations executive agent, and she was exfiltrating, and with her there was a New Zealander who'd been fighting alongside the resistance, and then also a South African soldier who is called Johnny Johnson, and that's it. That's all we know about him. And they also had 2 Americans with them. So very similar route to Bram van der Stok. With that one, you can access certain areas to see where they walked without going over the high mountains. If you like, the high mountain route is a very tough 3-dayer. Having walked that route and appreciated the terrain that we're going through, you can reach the border with Spain. Walking up to the border in Spain, I kind of came over the mountain pass, and then right before me was the Valle de Aran looking into Spain, and it was absolutely stunning. Bram van der Stocks, he makes reference to that viewpoint of saying how beautiful it is and that feeling of having taken a step closer to real freedom. Going into Spain didn't mean complete freedom. You just became a step closer to it and a slightly better feeling. So you could be arrested. If so, you would be put in Miranda el Ebro, a concentration camp where you could be held for a number of weeks until the right kind of exchange had taken place between the British and the Spanish in order to get people out of it. So it's a complication. If you managed to not be arrested, the objective really was to either get to somewhere like Barcelona, Madrid, or up towards the Atlantic coast and reach a British consulate in order to be exfiltrated with the right kind of paperwork.
The compounding risks, the changing risks, depending on where you are, where you're walking, who you're walking with. Talk to me a little bit about what's going through the minds of an evader, of an escaper. And this could be, it could be different depending on whether we're talking about someone that was flying, with the 8th Air Force and gets shot down later in the war versus earlier.
You're either an escaper or an evader. And the advice given was be an escaper because you, through the Geneva Convention, would be treated better. So there was an obligation to look after you. Whereas if you were an evader and said so, the obligation wasn't quite so much. So the best thing to do was say, I'm an escaper. Often the first thing that would happen, especially in Northern Europe, a lot of French families, farmers, ordinary French citizens would often observe you parachuting down. And if the Germans turned up, the advice would stay hidden. When the Germans disappeared, then the French would come back and collect them. And they would be looked after by those families. Of course, there were some French families who were extremely fearful and would have nothing to do with it. But there's some incredible stories of the helpers. Absolutely amazing, the risks that they took. So once you were hidden, what would then happen is the French family would obviously know who they might be able to contact to really start the ball rolling. So might be an ordinary French family, they'd know someone, make a contact, and then that's how an evader would join an escape line. So in a sense, a lot of it was pure luck because it's who first found you and what they did about it. You then join a formal escape line, so there could be something like, especially in Northern Europe, there was the Comet line, the Pyrenees line, and numerous others. So you would join that, you would get your falsified paperwork, and then you'd be escorted on your journey to wherever they would be accumulated. So often Marseille for the Pyrenees line, and then for the Marie Claire line, that was Ruffec, which was the opposite side of France. And then the Comet line would pick you up often in Belgium, sometimes in France, and then they would take you down the northern French coast towards San Sebastian in Spain. It was this knowledge of who the contacts were and how you could join an escape line. There were also a number of independent evaders, especially the beginning of the war when there were no direct contacts. People would just be helped by ordinary citizens across France, and they'd make their bid to cross the Pyrenees, often on their own or with a bit of advice. The very first 100 bomber group, so our masters of the air, the very first one was Lieutenant Dunbar. He did his own evasion as independent. He pretty much followed down from Bordeaux along the coastline, slightly inland, and made it into Spain. And he comments in his book that he lost an awful lot of weight doing it. So, yeah, quite incredible.
What are the conditions that they're working with? I mean, I can just imagine you're parachuting and you've just lost your airplane, maybe most of your crew. What do you have with you?
Well, the aircrew would have escape and evasion lectures within the UK, and they would have small escape and evasion kits. They would have a miniature compass, they'd have Horlicks tablets, they'd have wires, all the general things that you would take in an escape and evasion kit, just a small tin of goodies to help you out. Of course, you had to ditch your uniform as soon as possible on landing. Some did keep their boots, and of course, if you've got anything like that and you could easily be spotted, then you also have the difficulty of just crossing the road. So typically for the English, it's you look left and right and then left again, as opposed to right, left, and then right again. So yeah, extremely difficult conditions. And of course, if your aircraft's just come down, then you will have Germans searching for you.
How are you gathering your research? You mentioned earlier some of those individuals were able to keep, I think, diaries.
The vast majority of the research comes from the escape and evasion reports. So in terms of statistics, I think on the American side, there's about 3,000 escape reports. And if we break those down, around about 900 of those are regarding crossing the Pyrenees. And if we break that down a bit further, only about 10% of them really give sufficient information. If I then come to the British ones, there's about 3,200, which includes an awful lot of Europe. So we break that down a bit. A lot of the Pyrenees ones are very useful, but it's about 14% that are really useful. So if we understand what's achievable from those reports and what's retraceable, then we actually start to see patterns evolving in certain areas of the Pyrenees. And I've been able to build on those in order to hypothesize some of the routes, but with strong evidence. So that's really coming to fruition now. So there's a number of patterns have really been established, which are very, very helpful to talk about the evaders we normally wouldn't. So, and I'm really quite pleased with that work because it takes it a step further. And I'll keep pushing on those until I run out. I add some of the books that were written. The books very, very rarely give a route. An awful lot of evaders simply didn't know where they were. So you just piece together little bits of information to come up with a route for the most difficult. There's an interesting story of a Canadian who was on the Dieppe raid. So it's Captain Brown. He escaped from a train. He made his way down to Marseille. And when he was in Marseille, he wrote up his report on the Dieppe raid. That was then taken to Switzerland and found its way back to the UK pretty much before he did. So he then went to the Pyrenees. So from Marseille, made his way down to the Andorran Pyrenees, if you like, the Ariège region of France, and crossed there. So his is a fascinating story because he appears to have done it largely on his own. Pretty much gets to the Andorran border in a bad snowstorm. He takes a wrong turning, starts heading back into France. It so happens that a dam is being built in the valley he walks down. There are some workmen. He tries to hide from the workmen in some rubbish, fears for his life in the night, thinks he may start freezing to death. So he then approaches them. They treat him very well. They take him to a doctor, and the doctor looks after him, feeds him, and gives him red wine. Not perhaps something we do these days. But he recovers, and then in the morning, there are some smugglers in that area, and they take him into Andorra. Quite fascinating in that respect.
I can only imagine putting myself in the boots of these service members, the fear they must have to overcome to leave that relative safety of cover and approach someone and ask for help. It must take incredible courage.
Absolutely. And it's, there's those sometimes that were in such desperate situations that they just had to do it and they got the help they needed. It's impossible to overemphasize the support that many escapers and evaders had. And you just think, for a French family, for that matter, a Dutch family, any family that's helping an evader, if the Germans find out, you're deported and you may never ever see your home again. And indeed, your family will join you. So that the risks were tremendous. Impossible to understand that. If you're an escaper or evader, there was a very good chance you would just find yourself in another POW camp, which of course we know as the war went on got more and more difficult. But at least, you would live. Whereas a family, that's it. You'd be lucky to see you home again.
Let's talk about Masters of the Air. What are they getting right about the evader, escaper, and POW experience that you see depicted on the screen?
Overall, I think it's it's good. Purely personal view is, okay, it's television, which is fine. If we're paying our respects to the people concerned, that's a good thing. When it comes to the escape and evasion and the death marches from the POW camps, it's good. It's really good to see that, because we do begin to appreciate what they were going through. So, I remember, I think Lieutenant Dunbar's featured in Masters in the Air. For him to be the first evader and do it on his own is a remarkable achievement. And then, of course, we see the guys in a prisoner of war camp, and we begin to understand what the death marches look like. If we then apply that to the mountainside, it comes back to the Bram van der Stok experience of, as you cresting a mountain pass, you get that feeling of freedom. You're that bit closer to making it. And then, of course, once you're arrested, or if you make it to a consulate, you're going to eventually get out. But yeah, Masters of the Air, you have to take your own interpretation. But overall, yeah, anything that allows us to appreciate what they went through is a good thing.
What are you seeing and what are you feeling when you can help a family realize that moment for themselves?
If I can relate a story of a soldier of the 51st Highland Division, I'd made contact with a lady who was researching her father. She had his whole journey, with the exception of the Pyrenees crossing. I pulled together a number of reports, and of course he was in a group of about 4 guys that went across, but I was able to piece the route together and mapped it for her. And when I was communicating with her, she was in tears, because it was the last piece of the puzzle that she needed. And that feeling of being able to help her was just fantastic. Really heartwarming to know that I'd done some good for somebody. Very hard to describe. She was very emotional. I kind of completed the circle because I went to the area and took some photographs for her and shared them with her. So yeah, really nice feeling.
Let's talk about 2026. What does the process look like working with you?
The walking season, I'll start with this. The walking season, the Pyrenees really is March to end of September. It's when the snow's clear enough to be safe, weather's good enough to walk, and the mountain refuges open. There's a huge number that are manned, and you can get your bed and breakfast. You can also have a bit of lunch, and you can have a fantastic evening meal, in fact a 4-course meal. So they're very well looked after and hosted. So that's the first thing to say, the walking season. Then it comes down to really what people would like to do. So if you're not really into high mountain walking, there's the battlefield tour side. So you're driven to a number of cols, and the stories are told about the particular evaders. Then we come to the tough walks, which are a story in themselves. Anything from 1 day, fairly straightforward walk, to about a 7-10 day walk, which is an outrageous 250-kilometer route, 1.5 times the height gain of Everest. So pretty severe. Walking packages if you're capable. So what I'm trying to do is cater for people who are perhaps less mobile in the mountain sense, those that are very mobile, and try and create the right kind of accessibility. So the way I like to do it is to have a discussion. So website should be up and running in about 2 to 3 weeks time. Is going onto the website and book a call. The reason for booking a call really is to discuss the client's needs, understanding of what it is they really want. So less mobile to very mobile, and then also the type of escape and evasion history they'd really like to look at. I have, dare I say it, about 100 routes across the Pyrenees. And if we're talking from easy to very difficult, that needs to be scaled for somebody for safety reasons. So I don't want to give a package to someone or take them on a walk that they can't complete. This is about completion and looking after the client. So it's book a call, have the discussion, narrow down on the needs, and then make a decision from there on what exactly they'd like to do.
Are there any routes that you're looking forward to walking in 2026?
Oh, it's endless. It really is endless. I would never say a number of favorites, but there's a number of particular routes that are absolutely stunning. There's one area in Andorra where there's about 6 or 7 routes converge at one point. And when you converge at that point, you're really looking through the eyes of escapers and evaders, because you can see 2 cols, 2 mountain passes to choose from. One of them is considered straightforward and another is considered very difficult. And if I can relate another story, there's an incredible Canadian pilot called Julian Sale. And he got to that point. He's pretty much describing to you what he's seeing. And he says, you know what? I'll take the difficult route, because if the Germans are around here, they'll have trouble following me. Sad tale in a sense, because Julian Sale later lost his life. So to stand at that point, to understand his thinking and his humanity, but also to reflect on that he died and we're doing it to remember him.
There must not be a dry eye in the house when you come to that point.
I've shed a tear before, most certainly. It takes my breath away. It really does.
You're bringing people, ancestors, survivors with the local population. Do they recognize that maybe their own ancestors helped these folks that are now traveling through these places?
The French are really good at memorizing that period. So I'm privileged to have some incredible connections in France and share information with them. And there's countless people. I can relate another example in the sense of was researching a route that the stories are pretty much of 4 guys, and the stories are very available on the internet. What's not known is actually where they walked, and it was a real puzzle. I knew where someone had collapsed and I knew where they started, but the route just made absolutely no sense whatsoever. I went to Rekiet, and where I parked the car was very close to the French mountain police headquarters in this village, and I just thought, you know what, I'll go and ask them. So I walked in and then came out 2 hours later with the solution to the problem, which was just incredible, So I've a lot to be grateful for to the French mountain police. Engaging with the population's fantastic. All was made welcome. Dare I say, if I relate the Harry Camish story, the Bram van der Stok and Anne-Marie Walters. Anne-Marie Walters was engaged with a Jedburgh team. So the guys after D-Day that were disrupting the Germans quite severely. In the area of where Anne-Marie was operating was a Jedburgh Bugatti team. And I'd again gone into a village and walked into the Marie, and this lady indicated to me to follow her in my car. So we went off, and I ended up speaking to her husband, who then demanded I come back the next morning. He'd got all the guys together in the village, and we all went off on a tour of the resistance in the area where Bugatti had been operating, and they were led by a Major Fuller, who was an American. And the respect that the villagers have for Major Fuller is just beyond belief. The respect is incredible that they have for him, So he's there today for them. His memory exists.
How can people follow your journey and keep in touch with you if they're considering closing that chapter for themselves?
LinkedIn's a good place to find me. So just search for Allan Hunn. So Allan, Hunn, Hunn. And then the website, which should be up and running 2 to 3 weeks time. So with a bit of luck, once the podcast is out, it should be there. So that's madrecce.com. And then there's Facebook as well. That allows for a lot of discussion of what people might like to do on one of these tours.
I have so enjoyed chatting with you today. The impact that you're having on families is really, really special. Thank you for what you're doing.
Thank you very much for inviting me along tonight, Matthew. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks so much for tuning in. Story Behind the Stone is available on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, and on the Reach Across America radio network, on iHeartRadio, Audacity, and TuneIn. Just search for Wreath. Thank you for tuning in.